excited to introduce the next panel, which is a team of people from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. Mary Moriarty is the Hennepin County Attorney. She's going to rejoin us later today, but for now we have her team to walk us through some of the innovative things that they've been doing in the youth justice space. Vera has been collaborating with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office for a couple of years now, and they're doing so many interesting things that I couldn't decide what to have them feature today, and so we said, D, all of the above, and we're going to make them talk about 4 different initiatives that their office has worked on when it comes to using data to identify new programs and policies, and then also collecting information so that they can evaluate whether those programs and policies are working well. And so I'm going to introduce them, and then I'll turn it over to them to sort of touch on those things, and we'll try to spend more time on the 2 that are a bit more complex. And so first we have Sarah Davis, who is Deputy County Attorney and Director of the Children and Families Division at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. Prior to joining the office, she served as the Executive Director of the Legal Rights Center, which is a community nonprofit law firm in Minneapolis. She's from the East Coast and began her legal career in Boston, where I am from, and has spent almost 20 years working with children, youth, and emerging adults who are connected to the criminal justice system. And I think Sarah has put together convenings like this one before, so she'll be a wealth of knowledge today. Next we have Morgan Coons, who's the Director of the Criminal Division at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. He's been a prosecutor since 2014, working on a wide range of cases, from white collar to youth and a variety of adult cases. Prior to becoming a prosecutor, he worked for the City of New York, doing complex federal litigation. Josh Peterson is the Senior Manager of Strategy, Innovation, Research, and Data for the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. He joined in 2023 after 10 years of public violence prevention work in the public sector, which included the co-creation of a hospital-based violence intervention program that now serves 4 Minneapolis area hospitals. He has a master's in public health, and he also teaches violence prevention at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. And fun fact, he side gigs as a composer, recording artist, and performer in the Twin Cities music scene. I've also known Josh for a long time, and he's humble to a fault. So whatever he says he did 10 times that. Talk to him after the show. And then Chris Freeman is a managing attorney in the Community Prosecution Division, which contains the Emerging Adult Unit, which we're going to talk about a little bit today within the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. Chris has been a prosecutor since 2004, working mainly in the area of domestic violence, group violence, homicides, and shooting cases. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us. I'm going to first turn it over to Sarah to give us a little overview. Yes.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. And as was introduced, I'm Sarah Davis. I'm our Deputy County Attorney, and County Attorney Moriarty will be here. She was here earlier. She had to leave for an Operation Safe Summer event, and she will be rejoining us shortly. But in the meantime, you're stuck with me to introduce the office for substitute. But nonetheless, so our agenda today, we are going to try and do a high-level overview of several initiatives that we have undertaken in Hennepin County related to youth and data-driven work related to youth. So first we'll be talking about youth auto theft early intervention, and we'll move to talk about expanded youth diversion, our emerging adult work, and then our youth interrogation policy. You can certainly, we're going to try to leave time for questions at the end, but certainly we would invite questions throughout this conversation. So before I jump into that, I just wanted to give a sense of how we approach our work generally as an office. So when County Attorney Moriarty came into office 3.5 years ago, she sat down with every single division in the office, every manager, had meetings with every division, and with Josh was able to create a strategic framework. And rather than print these out for you, they're available for you at that QR code. But here's a general overview for you. Oh, I can go back to the QR code for those who want it, sorry. So the general overview is we have a vision, a mission, and then our values which guide our work. And then if you follow that QR code, you'll also see we have very specific strategic goals and initiatives that we're undertaking. So we can put this back up in a moment here, but the goal here really, and our focus here, is a safe, equitable, and just Hennepin County. And we're really focused on evidence-informed practices. So that's why this presentation was something we were really excited and interested in putting together and sharing with you all. So what we're going to talk about today is how we've taken this strategic framework and implemented it as it relates to our work with youth. So as we as an office think about interventions with young people, we've tried to account for a lot of the information you heard earlier today, although every time I hear evidence-based information about adolescent development and what works with young people, I learn something new. But these 5 points are sort of our guiding factors around how we think about interventions with young people. We believe that they are most effective when they are immediate, so as close in time as possible to the behavior. Now, anybody who has a child or a young person in their life knows that you cannot wait 6 months to say, hey, remember that thing that you did last school year? Now we're gonna hold you accountable for that. And they're like, what? I don't even know what you're talking about, right? I don't remember what I had for lunch today or what I learned in math class. Certainly don't remember that thing I did 6 months ago. They need to be individualized, so accounting for the unique strengths and needs of each youth and family, and I think we heard Cara talk about this extensively earlier, that we need to be person-centered rather than offense-based. Family connected, right? Young people do not exist in this world as independent individuals, right? They're connected with their family, however they define that. Community-based. So connected to that youth and their family's community, regardless of the level of services or supports that are needed. So you're going to hear us talk today about diversion. And I think a lot of times when I'm out speaking about this in the public and I say community-based, folks think that I mean that everything that a young person does should have a community-based diversion response. I want to be clear that that's not what we're saying here. This community-based intervention is appropriate for both diversion, but also for those really serious offenses, because what we know is that when we wrap supports and services around young people, even young people with our most complex needs who cannot be in their home for a period of time, that we get better outcomes, right? And I think if we think about this as if I'm a young person who's committed a very serious harm and I am at very serious risk for continuing harm to myself or others, and I can't be at home for a period of time. If you send me to Colorado or Salt Lake City, right, and put me in a program there, I might do great, right? I might develop a relationship with the folks there. I might develop a relationship with a therapist, case manager, really thrive. But as soon as you bring me back to our community here, you've broken all of those relationships that I have, right? And so we need to be thinking about how do we wrap supports and services around a young person so that when they're in our community, whether they're living at home or living in a secure place for a period of time, that when they do return home, because they eventually will, that those same community-based supports are in place. And then lastly, relational. So we're going to talk a lot about restorative justice today, both in our presentation and when you hear from Ramsey County and I believe Carlton County. And this is about accountability to those who are most impacted. I've been doing this work for a really long time. I've had an opportunity to be a restorative practitioner and to be a lawyer representing kids and now on the prosecutorial side. And I can tell you from my firsthand 20 years of experience doing this work that intervention and that kids, but actually all of us, are a lot more accountable to relationships than they are to rules, right? I think if we think about that for ourselves, it's just true, and it's particularly true with young people, that they're more accountable to relationships than they are to rules. And so how do we make sure that we're being relational in our interventions? Okay, so that is the general framework of how we're doing our work, and I promise I'm not going to be the one talking this whole time. It's just that Mary was going to do that, and now I did that, and so here you are stuck with me again on youth auto theft early intervention. But bear with me, we will be passing the mic shortly. So what we have tried to do is take that framework that I just walked you through and use that as a problem-solving, evidence-based approach for how do we address issues that are coming before us. So when County Attorney Moriarty took office in early 2023, youth auto theft was a major issue in Hennepin County, and I think kind of across the country. So what we did is we said we need to intervene. Something is not working, but we need to design something that is going to work. So we want to talk about how we did that. So the challenge, and again, these are all topics we could talk about for multiple hours, but we're trying to fit them into 10, 15 minutes. So we saw a significant increase in youth auto theft. You can see right there on the right, you see the motor vehicle incidents, theft incidents reported to law enforcement in Hennepin County by year 2021 through 2023. You can see that they're significantly increasing. But we also know that motor vehicle thefts are really difficult for law enforcement to solve, particularly with kids, right? Like you might have 5 kids in a car, they're wearing masks, and maybe the car gets pulled over, but they all get out and run. And it's really difficult to prove who stole that car, who was driving that car. These are all critical things for us to be able to make out a case. We also know, so what we were seeing was clearance rates, and we continue to see clearance rates for motor vehicle theft, meaning the rate at which a case is solved and sent to our office for potential charging hover around 3%. And again, this is not a shot at law enforcement. These are just really difficult cases to solve. So what that meant is we're seeing significant lag time between the incident itself and when services were being offered, and that we were also hearing from our law enforcement partners, we know who's engaged in this behavior, we just can't prove it yet, right? And so we knew that the traditional legal system could not respond until they could prove it, right? That's how our system is set up. You get caught with committing an offense, we think we have enough evidence to prove it, we can take you to court, charge the case, and eventually get services in place. But that's not working in this context. We're only solving 3% of the cases. We also know, let me just go back one slide here. We also know that the traditional court response was not particularly effective. So what we saw when we looked at our own data at Hennepin County Attorney's Office for youth charged with motor vehicle theft between 2019 and 2021, we saw an overall recidivism rate of 80%. 80% for youth who were charged. And so we knew, even when we could charge, it wasn't an effective intervention. And so we worked on a solution. And that solution is a 2-part solution. One is we need to address the fact that there's not enough evidence to charge. So what we did is we created an early intervention service pathway. We said to our law enforcement partners, if you know who's engaged in this behavior, but you just simply can't prove it, or you have concerns that this kid is always on the periphery of that stolen motor vehicle, we want you to send us their name. Don't submit it to us as a case. There's not a case that we can prove. Send it through a portal that Josh set up for us, and we will do a file clearance. We will look, are they already on probation? Are they open with child protection or child welfare case management services? Have they been referred to us through truancy, and are they getting case management services in that way? And if that's true, then we will just connect with whoever's providing those case management services and say, hey, heads up, this young person is on the radar of law enforcement with concerning behavior. Can you connect with the family and the young person about that? But if they're not connected to services at all within Hennepin County, we will send a social worker out. And we will ask the youth and the family if they want access to voluntary services. And what we saw with that is that young people and families did want access to those services. In fact, if our social worker who piloted this with us was here, he would tell stories about how he would call and the families would simply say, I knew that there's something going on. I'm concerned about what's going on with my child. I have no idea what to do or where to turn to get help. And that social worker then would get them connected. And in a moment, I'm going to pass it over to Josh to talk a little bit about the results. But the other thing that we said is when we do get cases for charging, we need to be mindful of the fact that we were taking a really long time to make these charging decisions, and we were taking a really long time to get to the point of offering interventions, like actual support and resources. Because what we know is when a kid gets charged, right, it's an out of custody, sometimes a misdemeanor, sometimes a low-level felony case, you know, our volume in Hennepin County is very high, right? So the charging decisions were taking weeks, if not over a month. And then by the time the court was setting a court hearing, that was weeks, if not months. And then by the time we get to the point of a plea deal or some sort of offer, we're talking about more months. So now we're in that 6-month range that we all talked about before that we know doesn't actually work. And so we said we're going to be accountable. We're going to work with our system partners to expedite the processing, and if we get in a case, we're going to make a decision within 5 days if it's out of custody, and within 1 day if it's an in custody. Even if they get released from the JDC, we're going to make a decision within 1 day about whether we're going to charge or divert this case. And they're going to have the court work with us to have an appearance very quickly as well. And then we worked with our partners in corrections to say, can you offer voluntary pretrial services to these families when we charge? Because we can't wait 6 months for us to offer probation services. We need to offer those right away. And so those were some of the resources that we put in place, and I kick it to Josh to talk a little bit about what we saw as a result.
Thanks, Sarah. So I saw many of you scanning that QR code, and so if you're looking at your phones, I assume you're not doing your day-to-day work, but you're just poring over our strategic framework out there. So those of you who are, I imagine you're seeing in there a commitment to data, a commitment to evidence and research, which is really something that we take very seriously in this office. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've looked at some of the data around this. I'll try to go quickly to get back to the other folks about the other work as well. So as Sarah mentioned, we heard a lot from young people and families that there was a need for help out there. There was really a thirst for services. And we see that in this data here. And so this shows that of the young people that we referred to a social worker, they attempted contact with basically every one of the young people that was referred. And they were able to make contact with about 2/3 of the young people who were referred to them. And among those they made contact with, they were able to provide or offer or provide resources to 96% of those young people. So again, the young people who are being referred to services here and their families are really eager for help and for services. And on the right side there, you see some examples of those kinds of services. This is really meant to be something that is flexible and adaptable to the needs of young people. So this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is not a, you were referred for youth auto theft and therefore you need X, right? This is about your young person is engaging in some behaviors that are a little bit risky. What are some things that you all might need to get that young person on a different path? And so you see here we've got things like mental health resources, case management, public assistance, getting young people re-enrolled in school, a really wide gamut of services. So beyond engagement, so we know engagement is important, right? Because at the end of the day, this is all about connecting young people and families to help. But beyond engagement, we were interested in looking at, okay, so what are we seeing a little bit longer term in terms of re-engagement with this kind of behavior? And so we went a little over a year out from the start of the initiative. This is about, I think, something like 15 months out from the start of the initiative. And we looked at whether the young people who had been referred had another youth auto theft case referred to our office that was charged. And what we saw was that about 2/3 of the young people who came through had no new charged cases, submitted to our office. And if you think back to what Sarah mentioned before, she talked about that recidivism rate for charged, non-diverted youth auto theft cases was about 80%. The 1-year recidivism rate for that is about 67%. So what we see here is basically flipping that on its head, right? Without any sort of intervention, we saw a 67% recidivism rate within a year. Here we're seeing after this initiative, about 67% are not coming back with another new charged case. And I think another thing that's really sort of noteworthy about this is that those who did come back with new charged cases overwhelmingly tended to have had prior system contact as well. So in addition to sort of this potential impact we're seeing around new charged cases, we're also seeing that it's really impactful for those young people who haven't had a whole lot of prior system impact. Beyond the impact on those young people directly, we did want to look at sort of what are the trends broadly. I want to give the obvious caveat here that these are pretty broad trends, and to take full credit for any changes in these numbers from this initiative would be a little bit foolish, I think, right? But we do like to think that this initiative is having an impact on what's happening more broadly. And so here you can see overall auto theft offenses in Hennepin County. So Sarah showed the graph earlier on about this really upward trajectory. What we've seen since this started is a downward trajectory. So in the same period, January to September that we checked from the year prior to the initiative compared to 2025, we saw a 40% decrease in auto thefts in Hennepin County. And similar, looking at youth auto theft, we saw a 58% decrease in cases submitted to our office for youth auto theft. So again, while we can't necessarily draw a direct causal relationship between this initiative and these numbers, it's pretty encouraging to see such a precipitous decline in these numbers.
Question. And yes, please go ahead.
How many full-time social workers does the Hennepin County Attorney's Office have?
So when we started this initiative, it was in the summer, and so we used one social worker from our truancy team, our Be It School team. When we moved beyond the summer, because he had to go back to working on the truancy team, we partnered with Hennepin County Behavioral Health, and we rely on their social workers who do this as a very small percentage of their time, who are embedded in the precincts and the local police departments across the county.
So how many so you mentioned truancy, do you know how many social?
We have 4.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, sorry, the question was how many social workers do we have? So we have 4 positions that are dedicated to sort of the equivalent of social work in our truancy work, because we receive over 10,000 truancy referrals a year in our office, which is a whole separate conversation. We took one of those folks for a summer to pilot this, and then now we work with the county behavioral health social workers who are in police departments and precincts. And we will be available this afternoon to talk more extensively about this initiative and to talk about how we got it off the ground, because it was essentially cost neutral for us, although I will say we had access to social work resources through the county to accomplish that. So we learned a lot from this process, and like I said, I'd like to invite conversation later. But some of the key takeaways really are that young people and families do want access to resources. It's about making those available and getting in touch with folks, and that our law enforcement partners, when we were about 6 months into this, said, can we make referrals for other types of cases, not just youth auto theft, right? And we started this in the context of youth auto theft, but we absolutely believe this is effective beyond that. So I'm going to pass it to Morgan, though, to talk about the second initiative we want to discuss.
So as we were digging into the data and thinking about how we're going to handle auto theft cases, we realized that we should look more broadly and think about all of the offenses that we have coming, all of the cases that we have coming to us. Hennepin County, as I know a lot of the counties here in Minnesota, have had a diversion program for a long time. On average, we divert 35-40% of cases every year, and this has gone back since before 1995 was when the mandate was created by the legislature to require diversion programs. So, we've always had this long history, and we had a huge amount of data. And so we started to ask ourselves some questions. Are we diverting the right cases? What is the effectiveness of our diversion responses? What factors lead to recidivism? What factors lead to success in diversion? And how can we create our systems? How can we adjust our diversion programs to be more successful? And so what we did is we reached out to some folks who are experts in data and analysis. Cara and Barb over there were instrumental in this. And I think we learned a lot by talking to some of our colleagues. So, our colleagues here in Ramsey County had been doing this work for a while. We learned a lot from them. I've talked to a lot of folks, and Dakota County has a really advanced diversion program for some criminal sexual conduct cases. Yellow Medicine County actually has a long history in restorative justice. And so, we started reaching out to people and seeing what they're doing, and we started to really look at our data. And so we gave the University of Minnesota a huge data pull, thanks to Josh and some other folks in Hennepin County. I believe it was almost 10 years of data, covering, I think, over 21,000 cases for 11,000 individual youth. And we really wanted to answer those questions, like what is effective? How do you think about the effectiveness of a diversion response compared to a traditional criminal justice response? And so that led to a very detailed report. Got another QR code for you here, so feel free to get your phone out and download this. I think we can probably get it to you in other ways as well. And the report and I think there's actually a really excellent YouTube recording on our YouTube page where you hear Professor Beckman walk through this.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add, I'm just gonna go back one slide just for a second, because most of this you heard Cara talk about earlier, but there's one point on here that I wanna emphasize that I don't think was talked about earlier, which is that 1-year protective factor. And this is something that we dug into in major detail, and you can talk to Cara and Barb about it later. But what we found was that recidivism increases with each legal system contact, except that if more than 1 year has passed, it's almost like a reset. So if more than 1 year has passed since the young person had that contact, we can treat them as if it's their first, because that's what the recidivism data demonstrates. And so we can talk more about that later if folks are interested, but this was something that we had hypothesized based on our experience, right? Like that if we're seeing either a decrease in the seriousness of the types of behaviors or a longer period of time, that we thought that we might see some different outcomes. And so I just wanted to highlight that. Sorry, Morgan.
No, absolutely. So the recommendations coming from the University of Minnesota, based on looking at 10 years of our data, synthesizing the research that was out there, were really focused on this idea that we need to make person-centered decisions. We need to look at that particular individual, the context in which they live, their needs, their strengths, and how do we help that person succeed. The data showed us what Sarah was talking about here, that reset period was a really important thing to think about, and that diversion can be successful for folks where it's their second or even third offense. Our previous diversion criteria was really focused on like a lot of those history screen outs that I think a lot of diversion programs have, and the data in a lot of respects just didn't support that as a reason to screen people out, and even folks with some history could get a lot of success. Another thing we learned here is that this is not something that you can do alone, that a prosecutor can do alone. This is something you need to partner with. So Sarah talked about our partnership with Health and Human Services in the auto theft context. We had to partner with the court, right, for early responses. We had to partner with probation. We had to partner with community. It was really about bringing folks together to make sure that we had appropriate responses. So this was our diversion criteria before we made a change about a year ago now, I think. It was, we did a lot of individualized work trying to be person-centered before, but our program was very much based on the type of offense and the history of the youth. We had a screening team that we put in place for our diversion program where we went through each individual case and talked about the youth and talked about their history and what we could do. What we learned from that process is that, when we went beyond our diversion criteria, when we offered diversion to youth, we were able to get some really good successes. Oh yeah, Kevin.
Can you talk about that screening team, like the makeup, like is it prosecutors, support staff, who's on that?
So that was sort of the before state was a screening team, and it was a combination of prosecutors, of victim witness staff, of paralegals, and folks sort of within the traditional, apparatus. And what we decided when we decided to move away from that, it was based on this data that was coming from the University of Minnesota. There's a lot of things that this allowed us to do. So it allowed us to make faster decisions, right? So now we're making decisions on sort of the objective criteria based on our data, and to get folks referred to community providers much more quickly. And that, obviously has benefits both for the respondent, for the young person themselves, but also for the victim and also for the community, because there was a response that was in place much more quickly. Yeah?
How many community providers do you use in your diversion?
So that's a great question. So we did before we had 3 main community providers, and then they would make referrals out to sort of like an array of providers that we had relationships with. We did a request for proposal, and we ended up with 5 main providers right now. Two of them were sort of, go ahead a slide. Two of them are sort of more this deeper end work. So for the more significant cases, youth that have more system involvement, have identified higher needs. We've got 2 providers for that, and then we've got 3 providers that sort of do the lighter touch cases. And this is ultimately what we found, is that you need to have sort of a menu of options, and you need to sort of figure out, because sometimes a person comes in, a young person comes in on a lower level case, but when you actually sort of learn about their needs and strengths, there's much more robust needs in place, and sometimes vice versa as well. So you need to be flexible, you need to be person-centered, you need to really work with that young person in the context that they're coming up in.
And do you have community participation involved in your screening process, or is it just your internal staff?
It's just our internal staff.
Right, so we've moved, as Morgan said, we moved away from the screening team, and we moved towards a much more streamlined policy that the attorneys can make those decisions based on the evidence-based policy that we put in place, driven by the research from the University of Minnesota. And so I think we go, is it that one slide? So almost all offense types are eligible to be screened for diversion now. You can see on the bottom, like murder, attempted murder, first and second degree assault, first and second degree aggravated robbery, carjacking. Those types of cases are not eligible to be screened. And again, part of this is it's not necessarily a function of the science drives that. Like when we were talking with Barb and Cara about this, is like, you can set that wherever you want. The science isn't driving that. We have to make these decisions. We're not making these decisions in a vacuum, right? We have to make these decisions in the context of safety and what our community needs as well. But almost pretty much every other offense type, and it's not first-time offenses, right? And so we have a little checklist that I brought along, like a cheat sheet for our attorneys to think about some of the factors they need to be thinking about. We went from a really detailed 9-page diversion policy to a much more streamlined, clear, this is what the evidence shows us.
Yeah. Should we hand it over to Josh to talk about some of the data on this, or
Yes,
how we're
because I know
monitoring?
we're a little bit behind on time here.
I'll take this one quick. So you've heard a lot about how the data inform these decisions, but it's not just about looking sort of retrospectively. We want to think about this prospectively as well. And so how are we actually monitoring the impact of this? And so we are really fortunate in our office to have an excellent records management system. We have an in-house developer who does a great job with that. And staff who are really committed to our data-driven approach here. And that results in us having a lot of data. And so we are big believers in creating actionable dashboards to use that data. A lot of people build dashboards and they sit there and they look pretty, no one ever uses them. It hurts my soul when we build a dashboard that doesn't get used. So we have folks who really dig into these dashboards, and we use them to hold ourselves accountable and hold our providers accountable in this case. And so we're able to slice and dice. This is just one screenshot here, but all of our diversion data based on case type, contract status, time from open to diversion initiation, all sorts of things. We're able to look at re-referral rates, recidivism rates. We're able to look at are we being sort of faithful to the new diversion criteria, right? So we're able to actually look at, these are the cases that should theoretically be considered for diversion. Are we actually considering them for diversion? And that's been a really useful tool to, again, like I said, hold ourselves accountable to, we said we were gonna make a change here. Is that change actually gonna be durable and last for a while?
Yeah. I think we've talked about a lot of these factors, and I think this is something we could dig into more in the afternoon session. So maybe it makes sense to talk about how we started to do this work for emerging adults.
Yeah, thanks. So, all right, when you talk about doing this in the youth arena, I think there's a large amount of buy-in, and I think for the most part, our community understands that, quote unquote, kids are kids. When we started looking at 18 to 26-year-olds, that's when my anxiety got up big time. I've been a prosecutor for 20-something years now, according to my bio, which is fascinating. So I guess I've emerged as a prosecutor at this point in time. But so there's a huge amount. When Mary tasked us with starting this project, I literally almost had breakdowns at several different levels. And we had a lot of discussions about what kind of cases we could take. And I know the research says that you should just, the offense doesn't guide things. But, for me, looking at what guides things, doing things differently is bringing about a large amount of skepticism in a lot of different arenas, and I'll talk about that more. But why do we focus on this? The brain science that we talked about earlier today, our overall strategic framework. Also, what guided this additionally was just some of our real logistical issues. We've had a huge amount of trial calls for our violent felony team, huge amount of trial settings recently, and we're just trying to figure out a way to actually help all of our staff do the cases that need to be done in a more efficient way. And if you want to deep dive into the data about our trial settings and everything else, we can do that later. I want to be limited on time, and Morgan can talk to you guys about our numbers for about 3 hours later. All I'm going to say is there's a boatload of trials, and it's stressing out our staff tremendously. Let's just leave it at that for me. And when we look at it also in the emerging adult arena, what was really fascinating is when we started looking at the reality that our system partners were already kind of doing this. Our probation unit, I think, 5 years ago, started what they call TAY, and that's transition aged youth. So they've been working in this framework for a long time. And also community providers, several community providers started looking at this emerging adult unit. Now, I would say that everyone kind of looks at our emerging adults and calls them in different age groups. I mean, I think we heard today we could probably have our emerging adults up to the age of 32. I don't want that for my unit, but it sounds like that's kind of where we're at, just for the lifestyle of our people and stress. But we defined it as 18 to 26, and all of these numbers are kind of arbitrary, right? But that's the kind of swath of the cases we could do. Let's see.
Chris, could I just
Yeah,
jump in
please.
with that for a second? So, I was the manager of the youth division when we did a lot of this work, and when I came to the adult division, I went through something that probably a lot of you have, which is like all of a sudden, as soon as the person is 18, the whole system changes. And we know in our personal lives, that's just not the reality. Anybody that has an 18 or 19-year-old in your life knows that they're not so much different from a 16 or 17-year-old, and nothing magical happens that on your 18th birthday to all of a sudden make you a fully formed adult. It is a process that takes a long time. And so what we wanted to start to think about is how can we use some of the tools that we used in the youth system to help these emerging adults. And so that sort of led us down this process of working with our staff and what could we accomplish from a reality perspective in terms of how do you manage large caseloads, how do you reassign staff, how do you do all that workflow stuff. And so that process did take quite a long time. And
Yeah, so we looked just at our own data and cases and case types and case numbers. We worked a lot with the courts, probation, and I would say also one of the unique parts of this particular group is we've worked with and discussed this a lot with the public defender's office in our county. And I will say, and I'll talk about a little bit more on different things, but I think there's been sort of a sea change in the way in which we interact with defense, and I think selfishly it's better for our attorneys, and also it's better for their clients, and it's better for our victims too, and I'll talk about a little bit about that as we go. So what do we decide to do? This was a long-held discussion, like, are we gonna take all of the cases? And the reality for me is I think our unit could take all of the cases, and that includes criminal sexual assault, homicide, child pornography, sex trafficking, kidnapping, officer-involved shootings. We could do those, but the staffing just doesn't work. And that's why we had that kind of compare and contrast. It's like, how many people do we need? I don't want to let those victims not have a CSC prosecutor on those. And I didn't want to overburden the staff of our unit. I think at one point I talked to Mary and I said, I can't put an attorney, even if we had test tubes and I could cryogenically make the best prosecutor available, we're never going to be able to do all of these kind of cases. We need to do figure out where we're gonna focus, and be kind of prudent at the back end. Could this expand to us doing all these things? Could we expand our attorney staff? Absolutely, but I think took a little bit of an incremental step. So what do? We do, I mean, the bulk of our cases right now is not gonna surprise you, are domestic violence cases, and a lot of our cases involve drugs, property. It's getting towards that time of year, so we're seeing an uptick in shooting cases and gun possession cases, and we'll talk about that. What do we do to train our staff? We had a lot of work collaboration, again, with probation, Department of Corrections, and we just talked to them. We had Dr. Kinshirf came in and talked about brain development. So I think we have the one thing I think organically has happened is Mary, Morgan, and Sarah were very, very smart about selecting a group of people that were dedicated to the work. And my job was to find a group of people that not were only dedicated to the kinds of work and the ways we're gonna look at those cases, but that were capable of handling our victims also where they were and handling the tough cases. So, I've just been bugging them recently. I said that we're having an uptick of shooting cases. We need someone that can really handle those high level cases. So it's the staffing component also, because we have to be prudent to our community, prudent to the defendant, and also prudent to our victims. So it is a real mix and match of how you can staff a unit like this. So we have 6 teams that are focused on felony A cases to be that kind of specialization. Not only with the development of the offender, but to help with the victim along, because that's very important. Josh.
So you heard my speech already about dashboards and making them actionable, so I'll keep this even more brief here. So we do have a new dashboard for this work as well. It allows us to think about sort of what are the outcomes of some of these cases, and we can slice and dice by a whole bunch of things. But another key piece of this one I think that's important is that this is a new initiative, and we want to understand the impact this initiative is having on caseload sizes, and staff. Chris mentioned that unfortunately we don't yet have the ability to cryogenically clone a bunch of Chris's, and that means that we have to be really sensitive to the impact that this is having on staff. And so one thing that we can do with this dashboard is actually break out caseload sizes, caseload complexity by attorney on the team here to understand what it's looking like for those individual attorneys and more broadly for the unit. What are we seeing in terms of trends over time by offense type, by decision, by disposition, by the law enforcement agencies that are sending us these cases, which really allows us to sort of think about how we might need to adjust as this goes into the second year, the third year moving forward. And the other piece, and I mentioned this with the diversion one as well, is that we've got sort of the case criteria that Chris mentioned for what goes to the A unit and what doesn't. This being new, we expect there to be some bumps in the road in terms of how these cases are being assigned. We've got a tool built into this to understand whether we're sort of like being faithful again to that criteria, so we can understand, are those case assignments happening in the right ways?
All right, so now I'm going to talk about trials, tribulations, successes, and lessons learned. And I will say that the trials and tribulations is definitely there. And and just the lessons that we kind of have from it. The first thing I would say is, if you're seeking to do this, and it makes all the sense in the world, is victim expectations at the forefront. If you're looking to do unique or potentially what was considered previously risky or divergent dispositions, you have to start having those conversations with victims on the front end. If you walk in and you have a victim that is experiencing a lot of cases, we've got our ag robbery cases. The victim expects, they see the maximum sentence, right? I think, how many of you guys see that? The maximum sentence is flashed out there. That doesn't even take into effect the guidelines, what really is possible, but they're thinking this person's gonna go away to prison for a really long time. If you wanna talk about something divergent, you really need to start creating that rapport, empathy, and just from day one. So we really want our victim contact and be going on pretty early on and be throughout. If you lose a victim along the way, in some ways in youth, there's a little bit of a shield from public nature. In the adult world, there's no shield. We are in public databases, we are on the news, it's just constant. So if you're gonna do something, you really don't want an angry victim. Somebody might be angry anyway, but you at least wanna have that relationship that you can do it. The other things, the other people that are angry at us sometimes are the courts. The courts have been doing things for the same way forever. In Hennepin County, there are certain judges that our attorneys are getting flack from on certain dispositions. That's okay. And the other end of the day is, like, what I talk to our lawyers about is, like, you make the best case that you can. The judge is the judge. They can reject this, they cannot, we can figure out amendments, and I'll talk about that in a couple of case scenarios. But really, it's to have this holistic building block of why we're doing it and explain that to the court. If the court still doesn't agree with you after you've done all the hard work of explaining why this is an appropriate outcome, that's their job. But we move along. But it's also educating the court. A lot of, we get law enforcement skepticism at some point, although that has really been much more tepid than I ever anticipated. That was been one of the more surprising things to me. We have a group of law enforcement agencies that have no problem complaining about what our office does. They have not really been complaining a lot about our outcomes, I think because we've been creating a lot of relationships with them as well. Lack of information is probably the thing that our attorneys struggle with the most. How do we get information and know who this individual is? Because what we've got is a bad incident, we've got a victim, we've got this, but we don't have a lot about the offender, and we have a hard time pulling that out of defense attorneys sometimes and kind of refocusing that or getting other things from system partners. And then the other thing that I think is hard and we're still developing is like, all right, we can accept the brain science that these are impulsive things happening, this person's in these, but what's the plan on how to deal with that? And like we talked about throughout, it's like, okay, how do you have that infrastructure that can let a victim know it's gonna be, we have a good rate of success, we can do this, if you really are building that kind of structure on the back end. So that's one of the things I would say is like having systems in place that can handle it is important. I'm hoping that as we build this, we can look at victims 2 years from now, 3 years from now and say, this works. We've had Josh looking at data for 3 years. We've had recidivism going down. Do I have a crystal ball that says this person's never going to reoffend? No, unfortunately, I lack clairvoyance. But we can say the data shows that this is probably going to work out. And that's never going to resonate a lot with an individual victim, maybe that had something bad to happen to them, but it means a lot coming from us that we say we have a high probability of success. I can say that with our diversion program now, and a lot of different offenders, I can say, this works better than probation. And victims in those kind of cases really appreciate that. So, go ahead, question.
Yeah, sorry if I missed this, but when did you start with the EA unit? And then when you did start it, did you roll it out? Like, did you go to law enforcement and say, we're gonna start doing this? Can you talk a little bit about the rollout and how you educated your stakeholders?
Can I
Yeah,
jump in there
please.
just real quick because I know we got one other thing to do. Yeah, the rollout was hugely important for everybody. I mean, we needed, like Chris was talking about, getting information from the public defenders. We went to the public defenders, we sat down with their leadership, we sat down with all of their staff, we gave them a presentation of what we were gonna do, and we asked them, what do they think of this? And we incorporated their feedback. We did the same thing with the police partners. We did the same thing with the bench. You really have to be intentional about building those relationships in order for something like this to be successful.
And I just want to add one quick thing. So Dr. Robert Kincher, if you're not familiar with him, his work, he's out of like Harvard Medical Center and someplace else in Boston. We had him come out and train our staff. We had all of our criminal staff attend, but we also set aside time in his time coming out to meet with stakeholders. So we had him available to the bench and probation, and our defense partners were there, right? Because we're just laying the groundwork for the science of what we're talking about here, which was like a really critical piece of it. And I think Chris probably so part of this afternoon, right, is to be able to answer some of these. We have one more thing we want to go through.
Yeah, and I'll just, this afternoon I can talk, I have a few different case examples that have gone through good things, bad things, and we can talk about those later.
But I do want to just lift up what Chris said in all of this, right? Which is like, we don't have a crystal ball. Like none of us has a crystal ball. So we can't say for certain in any individual case, what is the outcome going to be if we do this. But what we can say for certain is that the science and the evidence and the research tells us we are much more likely to have a better outcome for that individual and for our community if we go this path versus if we continue on the path that we had been on before. And, one time, it's funny, we did put it on a symposium like this several years ago, and I had a reporter speak to me afterwards who'd been fairly critical of our transformation work that we've been doing. She said, and we had people present on the science, not me. And she said, so you haven't been making this up. It's not an experiment. No, we're not making it up. But we also don't have a crystal ball. We need to be clear about that, right? So the last subject area that I'm going to just breeze through here really quickly, because I want you to have a chance to hear from Mary about what it's been like to roll this out, is our youth interrogation policy. So we created this policy because of what we were seeing and what the evidence shows us, but what we know about the risk for false confessions for young people. And we saw this in some of our conviction review work, right, where we had folks who had been spending decades in prison as a result of false confessions. And we also worked with national law enforcement leaders who have developed a body of evidence that talks about the fact that outdated tactics really contribute to false confessions. And we know, all right, we don't need to go into the brain science again, we've talked about it a lot today, young people are particularly vulnerable to this as well. And then we also recognize, right, that as a parent or as a guardian, right, I have children, if you ask any person, if your child was going to be interrogated by police, do you think that you should know about that? Would you want them to have a lawyer, right? And to a person, every person we spoke to said, yes, I would want to know, yes, I would want them to have a lawyer. Our law doesn't require that in Minnesota, but we believe that best practices says that those things should be in place, and the research supports that. And then we really took a close look at what happens in schools with police interrogations in terms of being disruptive to the educational environment. So to develop this policy, we worked with our system partners, our law enforcement partners. We had multiple meetings with them. We incorporated every single piece of feedback they gave us to make changes to the policy. We worked with national experts, and we engaged with the research. And we developed a policy that we believe protects against false confessions, ensures that parents and guardians are notified, and avoids the use of coercive interrogation practices. So once again, we have a QR code if you want to read our policy. Some key elements is that we will not use custodial interrogations of children under the age of 14 as evidence in a case. We will not present that as evidence in a case because the research demonstrates across the board that they're not reliable. We created a non-waivable right to consult an attorney prior to a custodial interrogation if we're going to introduce that evidence at court. And again, that's the key. You can do this, law enforcement can do this, but we won't present that evidence in court as reliable. We prescribe certain coercive interrogation techniques. We don't use custodial interrogations conducted at schools as evidence. And then there's a whole host of exceptions across all of these, mainly dictated by exigent circumstances. So I'd encourage you to read the policy. Some of the lessons learned from this, again, collaboration with law enforcement partners has been critical. It led to both a better policy and to buy-in. So our law enforcement partners they don't have to do this. Again, this is about what we're going to choose to use in court. The vast majority of them are using this and are working with us to ask questions ahead of the investigative actions. And also, hugely positive community feedback, because this is a no-brainer for people, right? Like when you talk to folks, they cannot believe it's even legal for law enforcement to talk to a child without notifying their parents and without them having a meaningful opportunity to consult with a lawyer. So we're going to be around all afternoon, but what I really want to do is have you have an opportunity to hear from County Attorney Moriarty, who's here with us now, to talk about the how, the why, and like the reality of implementing these evidence-based reforms.
Thank you. I had to go build some relationships with law enforcement, so I had to duck out and come back. You know, I hear, especially around election time, there needs to be an experienced prosecutor running the office. And I was a public defender for 30 years, chief public defender for 6. I am not a prosecutor, never been a prosecutor, and I think that's good. Because I have really talented, wonderful career prosecutors like Chris and Morgan and many others. And so for me, it was coming in and listening to the data and research. I ran a campaign where I talked about I'm not going to make decisions for politics. And part of that is we're not going to make decisions about individual cases based on what that's going to look like in the media. And you probably, most of you know how that's turned out at times. Because, you know, as everybody said, we don't have a crystal ball, and you can disagree with a particular decision, but still agree with the approach. And so I wanted to talk about relying on data and research, because I was not an expert in much of anything youth, because I always represented adults. And I think it's critical to rely on data and research about what actually works. And that's one of the things that I was able to do. And I was also able, and I am fortunate to have such an outstanding team and more people at the office upon whom I can rely. And Chris was absolutely right about his stress. And you have practiced as a prosecutor. You know what it's like, and I want to hear from you. So it was a lot of listening as well, and then making decisions about how we could move forward in a way, and this is also really important, where we could get buy-in from staff. It doesn't work to come in and say, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, without having those conversations and getting feedback, because people want, understandably, to be heard. On victims, so I meet with victims' families all the time. If they want to meet with me, I will meet with them, and very often it's angry people too. And one of the things that I knew this before I got this job, but what we do in the system does not heal anything for any victims. It might provide some closure. It might feel good, the case is done, somebody's going to go off to prison, but it does not provide any healing. People who are harmed don't get what they need to heal. So we have to come from that perspective, I think. The other thing I noticed is that starting from even our victim witness team, we were setting up expectations for victims where we would say, we are going to ask for X number of years in prison or something like that. And I remember distinctly one case we were talking about where a person had no record. He handled a gun, it went off accidentally, and he killed his best friend. So that was charged as a manslaughter of some kind. The presumptive was prison, right? And yet we knew that it was very unlikely that that person would ever go to prison. That's just not the nature of the culture in our office. A judge would probably give that person probation. And frankly, understanding what that person's background is, we might agree to probation. But in talking to our staff about it, it was interesting because they said, well, it's a death case. And so the consequences should be severe, and the family wants it. So I met with the family, and really, this was an interesting thing about what they wanted. They said, we don't think he has any remorse because we've seen him in the community, he was out of custody, and he ignores us. In the PSI, which we got, the defendant said, I so want to apologize to them, and I can't because I'm court ordered. So we had set up this system where what they really wanted was remorse and to know that he felt badly about it, and he couldn't do that. You know, the prison sentence for that crime anyway was like 3-4 years, and so it wasn't like sending this person to prison, who I think was 20 or something like that, very young, was going to make the family feel better, and what was that going to do to public safety in the future? And so if we are actually focused on public safety, and frankly on that case, if we had started out with the family saying, hey, here's what the charge is, here's what the likely outcome is, let's talk about that, so that their expectations were managed, because the way it was set up, we were going to object to a departure, and here's what would have happened. The judge was going to depart, we would have been there saying, prison, 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 and I'm not making fun of our staff. I mean, this is just the culture, right? It would have been, we asked for prison, yet we also knew that it was very unlikely that that person would ever go to prison. So how were we helping this family understand and prepare for the likely result here? So I think we've done a lot of expectation conversations, which are really important. And I also say too, because when we do these presentations, sometimes, giving them enough time to become a productive member of the community. So those are just some of my thoughts. I will be around all afternoon. I just want to say how proud I am of this team. And while I may have the vision in, I look at research and stuff like that, but the people in the office are really the people who formulate what we actually end up doing. They execute it, they talk our staff through it. And so it's, I couldn't be prouder, I couldn't be happier to be the head of an office which has such an amazing team.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you to all of our panelists. As we sort of gave you a sneak peek about, this afternoon will be a lot of workshops, and so you will have an opportunity to sort of pick some initiatives that you were especially interested in and learn more, and everyone on the panel Most of the folks on the panel here will be available to talk about that. Also, the example that you just gave about that case is sort of a nice segue into restoration and healing and the conversation that we're going to have on the next panel. So we are on a break now until 12 o'clock.